Anyway, it's certainly a nice, on a day in which you're about to appear at Politics and Prose to talk about your new book, to wake up and find on the front of the Washington Post Outlook section a review about your book, describing it as filled with, quote, fresh and authoritative detail. That's what happened, of course, to Rick Whittle today, and the favorable review was definitely deserved. When I heard some time ago that Rick was working on a book about the Predator drone, I was excited. He's a longtime defense reporter for the Dallas Morning News, and we knew each other when I also was covering the Pentagon for the Washington Post. And I knew Rick's reputation for thorough and dogged reporting. The core of reporters who cover the Pentagon tend to be filled with some pretty seasoned types. It's a complicated, demanding beat that takes time to get good at. Rick spent 22 years covering the Pentagon for the Dallas Morning News, and before that, he reported on defense and foreign policy for Congressional Quarterly magazine. He's also been a regular contributor to the aviation magazine, Rotor and Wing. So he knows his military stuff and has been especially drawn to aviation stories. His previous book, published about 4 years ago, The Dream Machine, was about the development of the problem-plagued V-22 Osprey, the tilt-rotor aircraft. So it's no surprise that Rick would have zeroed in on the Predator and provided an extensive account of the origins of the drone program. His book is a very timely one, of course, given the revolutionizing impact that the Predator and other drones have had in recent years on U.S. warfare and intelligence gathering. Rick traces the history of these weapons from their early years when they were regarded as fragile, useless devices, and recounts the challenges the unmanned vehicles have faced in overcoming deep resistance within the military establishment. As the Washington Post said, what Rick has accomplished in this book is, quote, no small feat, given the lid of silence that the Air Force, the CIA, the Obama administration, and General Atomics, which makes the Predator, have welded onto their drone operations, even the trivial parts. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rick Whittle.
Well, thank you, Brad, for that very flattering introduction, and I'm honored to be here at this fine bookstore. And thank all of you for coming to hear me talk about this book, Predator, The Secret Origins of the Drone Revolution. My book tells the story of the first drone used for targeted killings by the United States. The first drone whose operators could fly it by remote control from the other side of the planet. The machine that sparked today's drone revolution. I trace the story of the Predator from its invention by a former Israeli aeronautical engineer to its arming by the Air Force and its use by the CIA in the early days of the war in Afghanistan. But before I talk about those things in more detail, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to write this book. Like the co-owners of this great bookstore, I'm a recovering newspaper reporter. As Brad said, after 22 years of covering the Pentagon for the Dallas Morning News, I got out of the newspaper business in 2006 and wrote a book about the V-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft. And when that book was done in 2009, I went to New York to see my literary agent, and he said, okay, what are you going to do next? And I said, well, these unmanned aerial vehicles look interesting. And he said, these what? And I said, drones. And he said, oh, yeah. And I quickly learned that I was right, because just a couple of weeks later, the Air Force released its Unmanned Aircraft Systems Flight Plan 2009 to 2047. And this report predicted that by its 100th anniversary as an independent service, the Air Force would have unmanned aircraft ranging from moth-sized nano-drones able to flit inside windows and spy inside buildings, to largely autonomous unmanned bombers and fighters. And I found that fascinating. Now, at first, I had in mind to write a comprehensive book about this drone revolution. But as I began reading what little literature is out there, I realized that was a very tall order. That would be a very hard book to do for a general audience. And then I read a July 2008 article in Air and Space Smithsonian Magazine describing 10 aircraft that changed the world. One of the 10, and the only drone, was the Predator. And that brought things into focus for me. The Predator was the drone that changed the world. And as I studied what that meant, it seemed more and more evident that the Predator not only changed the world of warfare, but also opened the door to today's unmanned aviation revolution. And that was a story I immediately knew I wanted to write, the story of the Predator and the origins of the drone revolution. But what I thought was going to be a story about an extraordinary airplane turned out to be a story about war, a story about the Air Force, a story about the CIA. And my book is also a memoir of sorts, not my memoir, of course, but the memoirs of some of the main characters in those stories I just enumerated. I interviewed many of them and dozens of others who were eyewitnesses to the history that was made as this revolutionary aircraft came to be and was employed in the wars of the late 20th and 21st centuries. The story of the Predator is as strange as the aircraft itself. And many of those who made this little drone that changed the world were equally unorthodox. Take the Predator's inventor, Abe Karem, a former Israel Aircraft Industries engineer whom many people regard as a genius. Abe Karem was born in Baghdad in 1937, but he grew up amid the socialist idealism that characterized Israel in the early days in its early days during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Abe Karem was precocious. By his early 30s, he was director of preliminary design and special projects at Israel Aircraft Industries. But Karem grew frustrated by the corporate climate and cynicism that he saw at IAI in the early 1970s, and after working on a drone decoy to fool Arab air defenses in 1973, he was inspired to strike out on his own and develop new kinds of unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, as many experts much prefer to call them. Karem immigrated to the United States, the land of opportunity, and like all great American inventors, went to work in his garage. His was in Los Angeles. Now, as a young man in Israel, Abe had been a free flight modeling champion, and the sport's principles stuck with him. In free flight competitions, the goal is to make a model aircraft that can be launched by hand or towed into the sky on a rope like a kite, then soar as long as possible within a time limit without any remote or automated controls to help keep it in the air. Abe Karem knew all the tricks to designing high aspect ratio wings, long and narrow wings, to make a plane soar well. And in his Los Angeles garage, he built a UAV technology demonstrator that was truly innovative. Excuse me. Karem called it the Albatross, naming it after one of nature's greatest soaring birds. He probably had not read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. His Albatross had a high aspect ratio wing, a wing longer than its fuselage and very narrow, and its fuel fraction, as engineers call it, was an uncommonly high 47.5%. The airplane weighed 105 pounds when empty and could carry 95 pounds of fuel. As a result, Karem's little demonstrator offered phenomenal flight endurance, up to 48 hours without refueling, which was longer than any military UAV ever flown up to that time. Based on his Albatross demonstrator, Karem got a Defense Department research contract to develop a larger drone in a similar configuration for the armed services, an aircraft named Amber. In 1989, a senior Pentagon official wrote in a magazine article that the Amber provided an order of magnitude, that's a 10 times increase, in flight times recorded by previous UAVs, and had led the Joint Chiefs of Staff to establish a new endurance category for surveillance drones. Yet largely for personal and bureaucratic reasons that I explain in the book, Karem was unable to sell his aircraft to the Defense Department, and the company he created to build them went bankrupt in late 1990. But thanks to some other unorthodox thinkers, Abe Karem's revolutionary ideas about UAVs didn't die when his company did. Those ideas were rescued, and Karem and his top engineers were hired by a pair of brothers who had a genius for business to match Abe Karem's genius for aeronautics. Neil and Lyndon Blue are their names. They're the private owners of the San Diego area company that built the Predator, General Atomics. And while they're now in their late 70s, they're still very active and fascinating in their own right. In 1957, when the Blue brothers were in their early 20s and still students at Yale, they made the cover of Life magazine by flying a small airplane around Latin America during summer vacation. They decided to make that trip, by the way, before they ever took their first flying lesson. And that's because they weren't just sightseeing. The Blue brothers were born and bred entrepreneurs, and in Latin America, they hoped to find business opportunities they might pursue after college. And as a result of that trip, after they graduated from Yale, Neil and Lyndon Blue established a banana and cacao plantation on the east coast of Nicaragua in partnership with the ruling Somoza family. For the Blues, that venture lasted only a couple of years, but it was the first of many that by the 1980s had made them uncommonly wealthy. Now, as the name suggests, General Atomics began as a nuclear energy company, and it still is one. But it got into the drone business after the Blue brothers bought it from Chevron in 1986. They had a number of reasons for thinking drones might be a good investment, but among their motives was a desire to help the Contra rebels in Nicaragua overthrow the leftist Sandinistas, who in 1979 had overthrown the Blues' former business partners, the Somozas. The Blue brothers' first attempt at a UAV was a modified aluminum kit plane, a do-it-yourself job that they were trying to equip with GPS guidance. Neil Blue's idea was that the Contras, or an ally of the Contras, I'm guessing the CIA, would pack the plane's nose with explosives and use it as a poor man's cruise missile against the Sandinistas. Neil also thought such a weapon could help deter or stop a Soviet invasion of Western Europe through Germany's famous Fulda Gap. Now, I was surprised and not a little amused to learn that the man Neil Blue hired to run his company's unmanned aircraft operations, a retired Navy fighter pilot and Rear Admiral named Thomas J. Cassidy, gave this first General Atomics UAV what would later become a famous name, Predator. This unmanned kit plane had nothing in common with the Predator we know today except the name. But Tom Cassidy, who later proved he was as shrewd and skillful at lobbying and marketing as he was at flying fighter planes, Tom Cassidy liked that name, and he chose it for both those aircraft. As I say in my book, if necessity is the mother of invention, war is the mother of necessity. And as with many technologies, especially aviation technologies, war created the necessities that gave birth to the Predator and many of the innovations that made it revolutionary. The war in Bosnia and the difficulty of finding Serb artillery that was bombarding Sarajevo in 1993 inspired the development of the Predator itself, which in fact was a derivative of a smaller, less capable UAV that Abe Karem had designed called the Nat 750. In 1993, the CIA bought two Nat 750s from General Atomics to use in Bosnia. In the photo at the bottom here, the man to the right is Abe Karem. The man to his left is Thomas Twetton, who in 1993 was the CIA's Deputy Director of Operations and was sent to California to seal that deal by CIA Director Jim Woolsey, who had known Abe Karem for a number of years. And at about the same time, after conversations with Woolsey, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, John Deutsch, created a program to develop a similar endurance unmanned aerial vehicle for the military. But Deutsch was in a hurry. He stipulated that this new drone had to fly within 6 months. And to make that possible, he adopted an idea his deputy had come up with, a new rapid procurement method called Advanced Concept Technology Demonstrations. The idea of such an ACTD, as the military calls it, was to streamline Pentagon acquisition, at least some, by buying small batches of mature technologies and letting users take them out for a test drive in real military operations. If the users liked the product, more could be bought. If they didn't, relatively little time or money would have been spent developing and testing the equipment. In January 1994, the Pentagon gave General Atomics the very first ACTD contract. Abe Karem and the team of engineers he brought with him to General Atomics redesigned the Nat 750, and 6 months later, the new Predator made its first flight. And by the way, that ACTD process, the quick way the Predator was put together, is probably one of the major explanations for all the Predator crashes you may have read about in the Washington Post a couple of months back. But as we know from the Wright Flyer and the Spirit of St. Louis, an aircraft doesn't have to be perfect to change the world. Now I want to talk a little bit about how wars created the necessities that gave birth to the inventions and innovations that transformed the Predator into a revolutionary technology. Before I do that, though, I want to elaborate on why I said this book also tells a story about the Air Force and the CIA. One of the first things I did when I began work on this book back in 2009 was to find and interview officers who had flown the Predator. And the more Air Force people I interviewed, the more I was told that I really needed to talk to a civilian Air Force official in the Pentagon, a former colonel with an unforgettable nickname, and as I learned, an unforgettable personality. Snake Clark knows more about the Predator than anybody, people would say. Snake? I say, what's his real name? I don't know, everybody calls him Snake. Well, his real name is James G. Clark, and his Air Force job title these days is Director of Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Innovations. But here's how I describe him in the book. In reality, Clark worked for the service's two top leaders, the four-star Chief of Staff and the Civilian Secretary of the Air Force. He was their favorite fixer, an inside operator who was canny about how to bypass bureaucracy and who relished getting things done, as he liked to put it, quick and dirty. This was partly why Clark encouraged everyone to call him by his nickname, Snake, or if regulations required they salute him, Colonel Snake. He consciously cultivated the image of a shrewd and slippery operator who might be dangerous if stepped on, a reputation he found useful in intimidating real or potential opponents. Irreverent, sassy, and unafraid to step on toes, Clark was an acquired taste. He spoke in a preening pattern. Its flavor was slightly acidic and reminiscent of W.C. Fields, and when someone got in his way, he loved playing what he called Pentagon poker. I'll see your 3-star and raise you a 4-star. Well, I met Snake Clark in September 2009 and visited with him at his Pentagon office soon afterward. And I went back a month later and back again a month after that. And as I talked to Snake Clark, I began to understand that the Predator was unusual not only in how the Pentagon bought it, but also in the way its capabilities were improved and refined. Initially, as former Air Force Secretary Whit Peters pointed out when I interviewed him early in this project, the Predator, like the first personal computers, was a new technology that some people found interesting, but most weren't sure how to benefit from. But over time, a few interested innovators devised refinements, new software, new hardware, new communications architectures that transformed the personal computer from a novelty into a necessity. And much the same thing happened with the Predator. At first, this new endurance UAV wasn't important, just interesting, and only to a few people at that. many weren't quite sure exactly what it could do for them. The Predator offered phenomenal flight endurance. It could stay in the air as much as 40 hours, shooting live video in either color or infrared. But it was also slow and flimsy and vulnerable to icing. And while still photographs, taken by satellites and U-2s and SR-71s, were familiar tools of military intelligence in the early 1990s, full motion video wasn't. When the Predator made its debut in 1994, being flown by the Army, by the way, it was just a platform for a video camera whose imagery was sent back to a ground control station, a NASCAR-style trailer at the time, and went no further. But by 2001, 3 years after the Air Force took charge of the Predator, it was the first weapon in history whose operators could stalk and kill a single individual on the other side of the planet from a position of ambush and total invulnerability. That transformation was largely accomplished by a special Air Force unit Snake Clark introduced me to, a unit I had never heard of before, even though I had written about the military for 3 decades. Officially, it's the 645th Aeronautical Systems Group, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. But since it was established in the 1950s, it's been called Big Safari. And I'd like to read you how I describe it in the book. Created during the Cold War to help the Air Force, the CIA, and other agencies keep an eye on the Soviet Union and its allies, Big Safari quickly evolved into a real-world echo, though far less zany, of Q Branch, the fictional British Secret Service technology shop in the James Bond movies. Big Safari didn't rig attaché cases to spew tear gas or fit snazzy sports cars with machine guns and ejection seats, but like 007's Q Branch, Big Safari was staffed with clever engineers and technicians whose mission was to devise and field often exotic gear quickly. Big Safari was just more specialized, beginning with its first assignment in December 1952, installing the largest aerial camera ever on a huge C-97 Stratofreighter cargo plane, a project code named Pie Face. Big Safari's game was tricking out special-purpose aircraft, often with aerial reconnaissance devices, usually in a hurry and expressly for special missions. Excuse me. Big Safari's director when the Air Force took charge of the Predator was Bill Grimes, another colonel who would stay in his job as a civilian. And that's him in front. I reveal in my book how Bill Grimes secretly maneuvered on Capitol Hill to make sure that Big Safari got to work on and use the Predator. Another unorthodox thinker who played a pivotal role in turning the Predator into a world-changing technology is a techno-scientist of extraordinary intellect, knowledge, and ability who got interested in the Predator when it was still being flown by the Army. Snake Clark calls him the man with 2 brains. In my book, by mutual consent, I call him simply Werner, and I describe in detail some of the major innovations Werner came up with for the Predator. They include figuring out how to stream Predator video live to the Pentagon and other command centers from anywhere in the world, devising a way to cue manned aircraft pilots to what the Predator's cameras were seeing during the air war in Kosovo in 1999, mapping out a unique satellite setup called split operations that allowed a Big Safari crew to fly an unarmed Predator over Afghanistan in the fall of 2000 from a ground control station in Europe. And they include conceiving of the communications architecture that in 2001 made it possible for the first time for crews in the United States to fly armed Predators over the other side of the globe, a tactic called remote split operations. Making that link to a drone on the other side of the Earth isn't as simple as subscribing to satellite TV. You can't just shoot a signal up to a satellite in geostationary orbit and bring it back down to a drone on the other side of the planet. And you can't hopscotch the signal from one satellite to another without the distance the signal travels and the processing required along the way, introducing enough latency, enough delay in the signal to make it difficult for a crew to fly the aircraft remotely and probably impossible to accurately aim its missiles. But Werner figured out how to rig a system that holds the latency to acceptable levels, and the Air Force is still using that communications architecture he devised to fly drones half a world away from bases here at home. And that brings me to why I say this book tells a CIA story. Because Werner came up with the original split operations, as he called it, only so that an Air Force team in Germany could secretly fly an unarmed Predator over Afghanistan in the fall of 2000 to help the CIA find Osama bin Laden. And that ad hoc unit of Big Safari operators and Air Force intelligence personnel indeed found Osama bin Laden. Less than a year later, Werner then invented what he dubbed remote split operations to give the CIA the option of using an armed Predator to kill bin Laden without launching such a strike from German soil. In my book, I explain why that was deemed necessary. And while the conventional wisdom has been that the CIA armed the Predator and that, to quote one account, the Air Force decided that it couldn't be left behind, I found that the opposite was the case. The decision to arm the Predator was in fact made by Air Force General John Jumper in May 2001 for reasons that had nothing to do with the CIA or Osama bin Laden. I explain his reasons and the circumstances in my book, but here's what General Jumper told me in one of our interviews. All I wanted to do was to be able to cure the problem that we had in Kosovo, and that is the Predator is sitting there looking at the target. Why can't you put something on there that allows you to do something about it instead of just looking at it? Now, it's true that the project to arm the Predator gained great momentum after that Air Force team found bin Laden. But that acceleration was largely due to the fact that by early 2000, Richard Clark, Chief Counterterrorism Advisor on the National Security Council staff, and Charlie Allen, a senior CIA official, had both come to believe that the United States needed to kill Osama bin Laden before he killed more Americans, as al-Qaeda had done in the 1998 bombings of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and when al-Qaeda bombed the USS Cole as it sat at anchor in Aden on October 12, 2000. As I detail in my book, at the time al-Qaeda struck the Cole, the Air Force plan to arm the Predator was hung up in a dispute with the State Department about whether putting missiles on a drone would create a ground-launched cruise missile, which are banned under the U.S.-Soviet Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 2001. Richard Clark told me he personally intervened to break that logjam. The Air Force conducted its first Hellfire missile test shot from a Predator on January 23, 2001, and in the spring and summer of that year, top CIA leaders warily agreed to consider, and I emphasize the words warily and consider, using this new armed drone to kill Osama bin Laden. Despite the perception today that the CIA is addicted to using drone strikes to take out terrorists, there was a great deal of unease at Langley before 9/11 at the idea of what is supposed to be an intelligence and analysis organization controlling a military weapon in an operation that might lead to headlines such as CIA uses armed drone to kill Islamic militant. Despite that unease, Big Safari and a small cadre of Air Force intelligence officers spent much of the early part of 2000 preparing for such a mission. And by the first week of September 2001, most of the elements were in place. I'm not sure how well you can see the details in these Google Earth photos, but this is the Langley campus of the CIA on September 12, 2001. The inset shows a double-wide mobile home that served as the Air Force Predator Team's command center. That small rectangle next to it is the first of 2 ground control stations that were put there to fly the first armed Predators over Afghanistan. My book describes in some detail some of the early operations that were conducted by the Air Force unit at that trailer park, as some called it, and I describe them as they were described to me by those who conducted and commanded the missions. That includes the escape on the first night of the war in Afghanistan of Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar, whom, as you may already know, almost became the first high-value target ever killed by an armed Predator. Emphasis on almost. My book also includes what I believe to be the most accurate account to date of the Predator's role in the death of al-Qaeda's third-ranking leader and military commander at the time of 9/11, Osama bin Laden's trusted friend, Mohammed Atif. Now, I'd like to say just a little bit about why I contend that arming the Predator gave birth to the drone revolution. Unmanned aircraft have been around a long time, and they've been attempted in a wide variety of configurations. The U.S. military first started trying to build pilotless aircraft to attack enemy targets during World War I, machines they called aerial torpedoes. Between the wars, the actor Reginald Denny, who was a pilot and owned a hobby shop on Hollywood Boulevard, started producing radio-controlled target drones for the U.S. Army, which used them to train anti-aircraft gunners. During the Vietnam War, the military used jet drones as decoys to fool North Vietnamese air defenses, and Big Safari outfitted some with cameras for reconnaissance. Some were also armed, but they couldn't be flown well enough by remote control to return to base and land, so after taking their photos, they would be flown out over the ocean, where their engines would shut down, a parachute would deploy, and a helicopter would snatch them out of the air to bring them and their film back to base. It was a complicated arrangement that often didn't turn out very well. In the 1980s, at the behest of Navy Secretary John Lehman, the Navy bought a drone called the Pioneer that was jointly made by a U.S.-Israeli partnership for the Navy and Marine Corps. This was what the Navy bought, by the way, instead of Abe Karem's Endurance Amber. By the 1990s, UAV technology was improving, and the military was using or experimenting with several types of drones. But they were still a niche technology. Given advances in the underlying technologies, lightweight composite materials, smaller and more sophisticated cameras, digital communications, GPS, I think it's likely that in time, UAVs would have become more than just a niche technology in any event. But as I said earlier, if necessity is the mother of invention, and war is the mother of necessity, and the wars of the late 20th century produced the Predator, and the Predator made drones matter. Big Safari physically armed Predator 3034, which now hangs in the National Air and Space Museum, starting in January 2001, and tested it that spring, starting with that static ground test I showed a photo of earlier, then firing missiles at target tanks, and then firing them into a building the CIA had constructed to find out whether Hellfire missiles, which were designed to kill tanks, would kill Osama bin Laden if fired into his residence in Afghanistan. The contractor apparently misread the specifications and built a structure that bore little resemblance to the mud and wattle houses of Afghanistan. So the testers nicknamed it Taco Bell, and they hung this sign up. They were in a hurry at this point, so to help measure the Hellfire's lethality inside a building, they had to dispense with the usual mannequins filled with ballistic gelatin. Instead, as you can see in the next slide, they used plywood silhouettes and watermelons to simulate people. But while Big Safari and people at lower levels in the CIA were getting prepared to send the armed Predator after Osama bin Laden, Richard Clark was having trouble getting leaders of the Bush administration to listen to his warnings about al-Qaeda. The Bush National Security Council held its first meeting to discuss sending the armed Predator after bin Laden on September 4th, 2001. But while the ground control station was already on the CIA campus and many other preparations for using this new weapon had been made, neither the CIA nor the military wanted to take responsibility for pulling the trigger. So they decided to wait. 1 week to the day later, of course, everything changed. And a day after that, 3 armed Predators were on their way to a base in Uzbekistan where they could take off and land for missions over Afghanistan. Predator 3034, controlled from the trailer park at the CIA, launched the first Hellfire Predator strike in Afghanistan on the first night of the war there, October 7th, 2001, an event whose details I recount in my book. 3 days later, President Bush asked at a National Security Council meeting, why can't we fly more than one Predator at a time? We ought to have 50 of these things. And in December of that year, Bush gave a speech at the Citadel Military Academy in South Carolina where he said this: "Before the war, the Predator had skeptics because it did not fit the old ways. Now it is clear the military does not have enough unmanned vehicles." Now, as I said earlier, given the rapid advances in component technologies, it's fairly certain that at some point drones would have evolved into more than a niche technology anyway. But if the definition of a technological revolution is the same as the definition of a scientific revolution, a breakthrough moment that disrupts accepted thinking and offers unanticipated ideas, it seems to me that arming the Predator and rigging it for global remote control was just such a moment, and that what followed is a technological revolution. Of course, all I can offer is circumstantial evidence for that theory. But beyond President Bush's statement at the Citadel and the fact that the CIA has come to rely on this weapon they were once reluctant to use, there's this. As 2001 began, the entire U.S. military owned a total of just 82 unmanned aerial vehicles of 3 types: the Predator, still unarmed at that point, and 2 small reconnaissance drones, the Navy Marine Corps Pioneer and the Army's Hunter. A Pentagon study issued in April 2001, 5 months before 9/11, estimated that by 2010, the armed services might own as many as 290 UAVs in all, but still of only 3 types. When 2010 in fact arrived, the military owned nearly 8,000 UAVs of 14 different types. Today, the Air Force is annually training more drone operators than regular pilots. The Army is flying its own Predators. The Navy and Air Force are developing fighter-sized unmanned combat aerial vehicles. More than 50 nations are building their own military UAVs. And civilian use of drones is rapidly outstripping the FAA's ability to regulate it. In short, I think Air and Space Smithsonian Magazine got it right. The Predator changed the world because it disrupted accepted thinking and offered unanticipated ideas. And what followed was a technological revolution that is still unfolding. I thank you for listening, and for those who are curious, you can find some interesting documents I turned up in my research, along with some photos and a video of Hellfire Predator test shots on the website of George Washington University's National Security Archive. And you can find more videos by going to a web page for the book that my excellent publisher, Henry Holt and Company, created. And that address is simply richardwhittle.net. Richard Whittle, one word, .net. Finally, I'd like to thank my friend Brad Graham and Politics and Prose for hosting me here today. And in whatever time we have left, I'll try to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading the book. One of the, seems to me, hallmarks of a technological revolution is at first the technology is very expensive and inaccessible. Then it becomes far less expensive, and anybody can purchase improved versions for much less. What is to keep terrorist groups, small enemy governments, etc., from using armed drones to attack the United States and United States citizens overseas?
It's a good question, and there are a couple of answers. First of all, the trick to the technology is not so much in the aircraft. The aircraft itself is pretty simple, and there are a lot of places that might be able to build something similar in an aircraft. But there aren't very many countries in the world, maybe 1 or 2, who would have a chance of developing the communications architecture that allows you to control it from the kind of distances that the United States does. Secondly, the Predator has been successful actually only because it's been used against opponents who have no serious air defenses. An aircraft that size would have very little chance of penetrating U.S. airspace and getting very far to do any damage without our air defense system shooting it down. In fact, one Air Force general told me that the easiest way to shoot a Predator down is to fly next to it in a helicopter with a 12-gauge shotgun. It's just a very flimsy aircraft. Really the trick is the communications technology. Yes, sir.
I'd like you to speak to, which may not have been the focus of your book. I certainly very much appreciate it. In fact, I may well use it in my course this winter on technological innovation at Georgetown University, about the broader revolution in a new American way of war. And that is the phenomenon of targeted killing,
Right.
as becoming a central feature in this protracted conflict with radical Islam. About from your perspective, your sort of thoughts, maybe this is a second book, a broader question about its implications for how we fight and the legitimacy of this new way of war facilitated by this technology.
Right. Well, you're right. There is room for a lot more to be written on those topics, and in this book, I don't try to. I viewed this book as a work of history, a work of journalism. Just let's understand where things came from, and then we can understand how to deal with them. There are going to be limited. The ability to use the Predator the way it's been used against terrorists or suspected terrorists in Pakistan, in Yemen, in places like that is going to be fairly limited for the reasons that I cited in my first answer. I have two concerns, I guess, about targeted killings, and my first and main concern actually is not the weapon used so much as the process, the legal process that's gone through to put people on the list. You know, there's not enough transparency, in my view, in the current setup. We have the executive branch basically deciding on its own in a process that we don't fully understand who deserves to be on the target list. They have released a legal memo that offers legal justifications for the way they do this, but parts of it are redacted, and the actual process is not that transparent. Now, I've been told, well, yes, but we report to Congress. Well, they report to a handful of members of Congress who are in senior positions, and it's my understanding that they're forbidden to talk to anybody else, including their staffs, about what they've been told. I don't call that much of a check and balance. So I think we need better checks and balances on the process. I'm a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, among other hats I wear. And the president of the Wilson Center, Jane Harmon, wrote an article last year that I strongly agree with, in which she said that we ought to consider creating a court like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, the FISA court, that at least puts a judge in the process who has to review the evidence that's going to be used to put someone on the hit list. So that's my feeling on that. On the feeling of, on the question, which I think was part of your question of, you know, how moral is it to use a weapon like this where the people using it are totally safe? I think if you accept the morality of going to war in the first place, then your first duty is to protect your own people as much as possible. You know, this is why a lot of generals will say, it's a cliche in the military, we're not looking for a fair fight. And I think that's exactly right. If you're going to go to war, then you want to protect your own people first. And no member of the military, or for that matter, no CIA employee has ever been killed while flying a Predator. Yes, sir.
In recent months, there's been much publicity about the use by Israel of drones in Gaza. To what extent, as far as you're aware, have the use of the drones been more than just reconnaissance, but also using missiles such as the Hellfire?
Well, I'll have to confess that I have not studied the way Israel uses its drones. I do know that Israel has said, or it's been reported, that Israel actually was the first country that armed a drone. I'm not sure if that's even true, because we had some armed drones during the Vietnam War. They weren't very successful. So I'm afraid I really can't answer your question, and in the limited experience I've had trying to do some reporting on the Israeli military, I have to say, that they make our system look totally open by comparison. You can't get good information.
Rick?
Yes.
If just to pick up on the war is the mother of necessity theme, if I understand what you wrote correctly, the drone was kind of stalled as a progressing conceptual thing until the strange luck of Bosnia came along. If I could you elaborate a little bit on that? Would you say without that horrible war and without the lousy weather every day that forced them to figure out a way to get under the cloud cover, this thing might not have developed into what it became? And secondarily, you talked about the secrecy aspect of what they were doing in Germany. Explain that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Well, yes, I think the war in Bosnia was certainly an important event in the development of the Predator and the Pentagon's decision to buy an endurance UAV and develop them. But I find, we often write about things like this in terms of institutions and what one institution did. I find personality to be really the most important aspect of government decision making. It's not just a matter of the Pentagon deciding to do something. It's the fact that John Deutsch was there and he was friends with Jim Woolsey, who was the CIA director, and more importantly than that, Jim Woolsey was friends with Abe Karem. So, it's a sort of a confluence of events, but it's also a confluence of personalities. It's interesting to me that you asked about the German operation. They chose to put the ground control station at Ramstein Air Base in Germany because, but the airplane had to take off from somewhere within 500 miles of Tarnak Farms, where Osama bin Laden was thought to be living. There was no, if you take a map of Afghanistan and put and draw a circle with a 500-mile radius around Tarnak Farms, you go through Iran, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. In none of those places could you put all the equipment that's needed to operate a Predator. It actually requires not just a ground control station, but a couple of satellite Earth terminals and some other equipment. And altogether, it ends up being about 55 people. So there was no way to put all that in one of those countries and keep it covert. And they did not want Al-Qaeda or the Taliban to know that they were flying drones over Afghanistan looking for Osama bin Laden. So this techno-scientist I talked about, Werner, figured out that a small team in Uzbekistan could take off and land the drones there using what's called a C-band line-of-sight antenna, and then it could be taken over by a crew that would operate it by satellite using what's called a KU-band antenna. And this crew they put it at Ramstein because that's the biggest U.S. air base in Europe. Lots of things going on. Nobody's going to notice another thing that looks like a freight container with a couple of satellite terminals. And in fact, that's the way it worked. And my understanding is, and I say in the book, that they didn't even tell the German government that they were doing this. It was very secret. The people who were sent there was a very small unit of Air Force people who went there on verbal orders at first. Later, a formal order was issued. You can find that on the George Washington University website. I mentioned the National Security Archive. It was called the 32nd Expeditionary Air Intelligence Squadron. And they were told that their phones were tapped, their mail was being read, their waste baskets were being searched every day, and everything they did was to be utterly secret. And I think that one reason was that they didn't want the German government to know what they were doing there. But later, as I said in my remarks, they decided to move the ground control station to the United States once they armed the Predator and decided they might send it to kill Osama bin Laden, because they didn't think that they could legally fire a weapon from German soil under what's called the Status of Forces Agreement. Yes.
Interested in whether you have interviewed people in the Air Force who were resistive to the idea of a manless Air Force.
It's hard to find any today who will admit it, you know, because unmanned aircraft are now a major part. The resistance actually, I think, is most evident in the younger pilots who did not want to be assigned to fly the Predator. When it was first, when the Air Force first took over the Predator, and they would send pilots, they would take, you know, these people, they want to be pilots because they want to defy the law of gravity. You know, they want to have, it's an exciting thing to do. And in fact, there are a couple of F-16 pilots who made a hilarious rap video that you can find on the internet called 1G. And it's a lament about living life at 1G, you know. And I recommend it to you. It's really, did not do their careers much good, I understand, but it's really a lot of fun to watch. And you know, a couple of the people who I interviewed for the book and who are who you can read about in the book were fighter pilots who were reassigned to the Predator. One was a young woman. I only use her call sign, her radio call sign in the book. Genghis was her call sign. She was an F-15 pilot. She had dropped bombs in Kosovo. She had flown patrols over Iraq when we were enforcing no-fly zones. She thought she was pretty good. And when she got assigned to go fly the Predator, which, by the way, they called being sent to the land of misfit toys, she said that when she arrived, another F-15 pilot who was there because he had injured his back in a hard landing said to her, "What did you screw up to get here?" No, so it was mainly, I think at the top, you know, people who make general may have been fighter pilots, and some generals didn't like the Predator. Well, one in particular who's in the book is General Richard Hawley, who was the commander of what's called Air Combat Command. And I describe a scene in the book in which after the Air Force took over the Predator, there was a meeting at Air Combat Command, and he basically said, look, you know, he said he felt like a car salesman trying to push a lemon. He made a speech in which he sort of said, well, you know, it's not my idea, but we've got this thing, we're going to have to live with it. So, but there was resistance. Yes.
Kind of a related question, Rick. Could you talk a little bit about the coordination, cooperation, or the rivalry among the various CIA, Army, Navy, on the development and the use of drones today?
Well, I think there's less, I don't think there's that much rivalry on the development of them. I think, in fact, there's been quite a bit of cooperation. Now, there is an issue these days of whether the CIA or Joint Special Operations Command, some people say Joint Special Operations Command should be given all responsibility for flying the drones that are used in targeted killings. And there's resistance to that idea. But early on, this period that I write about in my book, when that team of Air Force people got to the CIA and started working out of this double-wide mobile home and ground control station, some of the people in the CIA building, which they called the big house, started calling them trailer trash. So they had a bull session, and somebody said, well, you know, we're out here on the western part of the parking lot. We might as well be in West Virginia. We ought to put some pink flamingos out and get a car up on cinder blocks. And well, they couldn't do the car on cinder blocks, but they took, there was a broken toilet in the mobile home, and they took it out and put it on the lawn and put a flower pot in it and brought 4 pink flamingos and stuck them around there as decoration. And the CIA people, most CIA people who saw it apparently were pretty horrified, but I was told that George Tenet came out and saw this and just had a good laugh and got the toilet fixed for them in the mobile home, but let them keep the pink flamingos.
We're almost out of time, so let me just make this the last question. You know, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of secrecy around this program over the years, and there continues to be a lot of secrecy around drone operations imposed by the Obama administration. But as Craig Whitlock noted in his Washington Post review, you know, what you've done is no small feat in providing a very detailed account of a lot of this previously secret history. I wondered what thoughts you had on why you were able to do this. I mean, was it simply a matter of your enterprising reporting, or do you think people, a number of people decided now was the time to look back and disclose some of this?
Well, let me say, it was not easy, but ultimately I began to talk to people who I think felt that they were very proud of having taken part in what they regarded as a revolution, as important operations for the Air Force. And over the years, I think that some of them began to feel that they weren't given proper credit for what they accomplished. You know, there was sort of this notion out there that the CIA did all this. And you know, so there was sort of professional jealousy among some. The people who did this are very proud of what they did. I mean, a lot of them are in the book by name. I also, in doing interviews, said, look, I'm not asking you to tell me classified information. As you know, there are a lot of things that sort of remain secret that aren't actually classified, just because people don't talk about them. And so it was just a matter of continuing to talk to people as much as possible, and also I was not trying to reveal current operational details. You know, the trailer park is long since gone. I mean, that moved away from the CIA in about 2002. So we're really talking about history here. Thank you.